13 wedding guests, 13 coffins, one bride who never shed a tear. Before we dive into one of the most chilling true crime stories from 19th century New England, I need to know, where are you listening to this story from? Drop your location in the comments below, and if you're ready for a tale of cold revenge, calculated silence, and a bride who turned a celebration into a graveyard, make sure you hit that subscribe button. Trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. Because what started as whispers of divine punishment ended with a truth far more terrifying than any curse. This is the story of how love died, and vengeance was served cold, at a wedding feast that no one would survive. The autumn of 1887 came early to Ashford Hollow, a small village nestled deep in the hills of rural Massachusetts. The maple trees had already shed half their crimson leaves by mid-September, and a persistent fog clung to the valley each morning, thick as wool and twice as suffocating. The villagers, hearty folk descended from Puritan settlers, took the early cold as a sign, though of what, they couldn't quite agree. On the morning of September 23rd, the Whitmore estate buzzed with preparations for what should have been the social event of the season. Reverend Thomas Whitmore, patriarch of one of Ashford Hollow's founding families, was marrying off his youngest son, Jonathan, to a young woman from a neighboring county. The bride's name was Eleanor Carver, though few in the village had met her before the week of the wedding. Martha Henshaw, the village's most prolific gossip and seamstress, was among the first to meet Eleanor when she arrived 3 days before the ceremony. Martha would later testify, in whispers in her kitchen to anyone who would listen, that something about the bride had unsettled her from the very first moment. She wore black, Martha told her neighbor, Mrs. Adelaide Frost, as they prepared pies for the wedding feast. Not grey, not navy, black as a widow's weeds. I asked her, polite as I could, if she was in mourning. Do you know what she said? Adelaide leaned closer, flour dusting her considerable bosom. What? She said, not yet. Just like that. Not yet? What kind of bride says such a thing? But Martha's concerns were dismissed. The Whitmores were prominent, wealthy, and well-respected. Reverend Whitmore himself had vouched for the match, explaining that Eleanor came from good stock, the Carvers of Hampshire County, a family fallen on hard times, but still respectable. The girl had been educated at a girls' seminary, could play piano, spoke French. She was 23, perhaps a touch old for a first marriage, but handsome enough in a severe, sharp-featured way. Jonathan Whitmore, 26 and soft-spoken to the point of timidity, seemed genuinely enamored. Those who saw them together noted how Eleanor would touch his arm, speak to him in low, measured tones, and how he would flush with pleasure at her attention. His older brothers, Charles and William, were less enthusiastic. There's something not quite right about her, Charles confided to his wife Prudence as they dressed for the wedding rehearsal. Father won't hear a word against the match, but I've seen how she looks at him, like she's studying him, calculating. You're imagining things, Prudence replied, though her voice lacked conviction. She, too, had noticed Eleanor's peculiar stillness, the way her dark eyes seemed to absorb everything while revealing nothing. The wedding rehearsal took place on a Thursday evening in the small white church that had stood at the center of Ashford Hollow since 1702. The building was draughty, and the September chill crept through the floorboards. Eleanor stood at the altar in a simple grey dress, her pale hands folded, her expression serene. Reverend Whitmore, a robust man of 60 with a voice that could shake the rafters during Sunday sermons, walked through the ceremony with practiced ease. But even he seemed subdued that evening. Later, he would tell his wife, Catherine, that he'd felt an inexplicable weight in the church, as though the air itself had grown heavy. Probably just nerves, Catherine had replied, busy organizing seating arrangements. It's your youngest boy, after all. The wedding was set for Saturday afternoon. By Friday evening, the Whitmore house was a hive of activity. Relatives had arrived from Boston and Providence. The kitchen staff, 3 local women hired for the occasion worked until midnight preparing the feast. Roasted venison, glazed ham, apple pies, plum puddings, and an elaborate wedding cake ordered from a bakery in Worcester. Eleanor remained in her room for most of Friday, claiming a headache. Jonathan brought her tea and toast, which she accepted with a wan smile. The household staff noted that she'd brought very little luggage, a single trunk and a smaller case, both locked. When questioned, she explained that her belongings would be sent later, after the honeymoon. Saturday morning dawned cold and bright. The fog had lifted, revealing a sky so blue it hurt to look at. The wedding was scheduled for 2 o'clock, followed by a feast and dancing that would last well into the evening. At noon, Eleanor finally emerged from her room. She wore a wedding dress that defied all convention, deep charcoal grey, almost black, with long sleeves and a high collar that covered her throat completely. The bodice was elaborately beaded, the workmanship exquisite, but the color choice sent ripples of shocked whispers through the assembled guests. Martha Henshaw clutched her chest. "She looks like she's going to a funeral." "Perhaps it's a French fashion," someone suggested weakly. Eleanor ignored the stares. She moved through the house with measured grace, her face pale but composed. When Catherine Whitmore gently suggested that perhaps Eleanor might prefer the white dress that had been prepared as an alternative, Eleanor's response was polite but absolute. "This dress belonged to my mother," she said softly. "I would not dishonor her memory by wearing another." What could Catherine say to that? She nodded, uncomfortable, and the matter was dropped. The ceremony itself was brief. Reverend Whitmore's voice wavered only once when he pronounced them man and wife. Jonathan kissed his bride, a chaste, brief touch of lips, and Eleanor's expression remained unchanged. She didn't smile. She didn't weep with joy as brides were expected to do. She simply took Jonathan's arm and walked back down the aisle, her dark dress rustling like dead leaves. The feast began at 3 o'clock. Tables had been set up in the Whitmores' large dining room and spilling into the parlor. Nearly 60 people attended. Family, friends, prominent villagers, business associates of the Reverend. The food was abundant, the wine flowed freely, and gradually the strange tension of the ceremony began to dissipate. Eleanor sat at the head table beside Jonathan, barely touching her food. She sipped water, declined wine, and spoke only when directly addressed. Several guests later recalled that she seemed to be waiting for something, her gaze occasionally moving to the clock on the mantel. At precisely 5 o'clock, as the sun began its descent and the first lamps were being lit, Eleanor rose from her seat. She picked up a small bell that had been placed on the table, meant to call for toasts, and rang it 3 times. The room fell silent. "I would like to propose a toast," Eleanor said. Her voice was quiet, but carried clearly in the hush. "To family, to loyalty, and to justice, however long delayed." There was a confused murmur. Guests raised their glasses uncertainly. The toast was odd, certainly, but perhaps the girl was simply nervous. Jonathan looked up at his bride with adoring confusion. Eleanor lifted her own glass, water not wine, and drank. Around the room, 60 guests did the same, and then, with a small, cold smile that no one would ever forget, Eleanor set down her glass and left the room. Sunday morning brought the first sign that something was terribly wrong. Dr. Samuel Brennan, Ashford Hollow's only physician, was roused from bed at dawn by frantic pounding on his door. He found Charles Whitmore on his doorstep, still in his nightshirt, his face grey with panic. "It's Prudence," Charles gasped, "and at least a dozen others from the wedding. They're all sick, violently sick." Dr. Brennan grabbed his bag and followed Charles through the empty streets. The Whitmore house, so festive just hours ago, had become a scene of chaos. Moans echoed through the hallways. The acrid smell of vomit permeated every room. Prudence Whitmore lay in her bed, convulsing with dry heaves, her skin clammy and pale. Her breathing came in shallow gasps. In the next room, William Whitmore was in similar condition. Downstairs, 3 wedding guests who'd stayed overnight were sprawled in various states of distress. "When did it start?" Dr. Brennan asked, checking Prudence's pulse. It was rapid and weak. "Around 3 in the morning," Charles replied, his hands shaking. "Prudence woke me, saying her stomach felt like it was on fire. Then she started vomiting. I heard others in the house. It seemed like it hit everyone at once." Dr. Brennan moved from patient to patient, his face growing more grave with each examination. The symptoms were consistent: severe abdominal pain, nausea, vomiting, weakness, and in some cases, a strange burning sensation in the throat and mouth. Several patients complained of an unusual metallic taste. "Has everyone eaten the same foods?" the doctor asked. "The wedding feast," Charles said. "We all ate from the same tables." "Not all," came a voice from the doorway. It was Eleanor. She stood in the threshold of the sick room, still wearing a black dressing gown, her dark hair in a long braid over her shoulder. She looked well-rested and perfectly healthy. "I ate very little at the feast," she continued, her voice calm. "I have a delicate constitution. I find rich foods disagreeable." Dr. Brennan studied her. "And your husband? How is Jonathan?" "Sleeping still. He seems unaffected. He didn't eat much either. Wedding nerves," he said. This was true. Jonathan appeared later that morning, concerned and confused, but showing no symptoms. He'd been too anxious to eat much at the feast, and what he had consumed had been simple bread and cheese. By midday Sunday, Dr. Brennan had visited a dozen homes in Ashford Hollow. The pattern was unmistakable. Anyone who had attended the wedding feast and partaken heartily of the food was now violently ill. Those who had eaten sparingly or not at all, like Jonathan, like Eleanor, like a few abstemious elderly guests, remained healthy. The village quickly concluded it was food poisoning. Perhaps the meat had spoiled in the unseasonable warmth before the cold snap. Perhaps the cream in the puddings had turned. Martha Henshaw, though sick herself, managed to croak out theories between bouts of retching. But Dr. Brennan wasn't convinced. Food poisoning was common enough, yes, but the severity and uniformity of these symptoms troubled him. He'd seen bad meat sicken people before. This was different. This was worse. By Monday, 3 of the wedding guests had died. The first was Prudence Whitmore. Despite Dr. Brennan's best efforts, purgatives, laudanum, cold compresses, her condition deteriorated rapidly. By Monday afternoon, her kidneys had failed. She died at sunset, with Charles holding her hand, her last words an agonized plea for water. The second death came that same evening. Adelaide Frost, the cheerful neighbor who'd gossiped with Martha about Eleanor's black dress, succumbed to respiratory failure. Her lungs had filled with fluid. She effectively drowned in her own bed. The third victim was a cousin from Providence, a young man of 30 named Robert Hayes. He'd been one of the heartiest eaters at the feast, going back for seconds and thirds of everything. He died in violent convulsions just after midnight, his face contorted in agony. Panic seized Ashford Hollow like a vice. Reverend Whitmore, though suffering from symptoms himself, organized a town meeting in the church on Tuesday morning. The pews were barely half full. Too many were sick. Too many were tending the sick. And many were too frightened to leave their homes. "We must have faith," the Reverend declared, though his voice lacked its usual thunder. He was pale, sweating, and had to grip the pulpit for support. "This is a trial, perhaps even a punishment for sins known or unknown. We must pray for deliverance and trust in God's mercy." From the back of the church, a voice called out, "What if it's not divine punishment? What if someone poisoned us?" The congregation erupted in shocked murmurs. Dr. Brennan, sitting in the front pew, stood and raised his hands for silence. "I cannot rule out the possibility of contamination," he said carefully. "But poisoning suggests intent, and who would wish such evil upon us? We are a community. We know each other. Let us not add paranoia to our suffering." Yet the seed was planted. That afternoon, Dr. Brennan returned to the Whitmore house to check on his patients. He found Eleanor in the kitchen, calmly preparing tea. The kitchen staff had all fallen ill. She was managing on her own. "How is your husband?" Brennan asked. "Concerned for his family, of course. He's sitting with his father now." "And you remain well?" "Quite well, thank you." Eleanor poured hot water over tea leaves with steady hands. "I've always been fortunate in my health." Dr. Brennan watched her carefully. There was something unsettling about her composure. While the house groaned with suffering, while her new sister-in-law lay dead in the parlor, awaiting burial, Eleanor moved through her domestic tasks with eerie tranquility. "Mrs. Whitmore," he began, choosing his words carefully, "can you think of anything unusual about the feast? Anything at all that might help me understand this illness?" Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, her dark eyes fixed on the steaming teapot. "No," she said finally. "Nothing unusual. It was a wedding feast like any other, food prepared with care, wine poured with generosity. Perhaps that generosity was the problem. Perhaps we celebrated too enthusiastically, and now we're paying the price." The way she said "we" felt wrong. She wasn't sick. She wasn't paying any price, but Dr. Brennan had no evidence, only a gnawing suspicion in his gut. He thanked her and left. By Tuesday evening, the death toll had risen to 7. The village gravedigger, himself sick but still functional, worked from dawn to dusk, preparing the frozen ground for burials. The Reverend Whitmore, despite his illness, insisted on conducting the funeral services himself. Eleanor attended each funeral, dressed in her black wedding dress. She stood beside Jonathan, her gloved hand resting lightly on his arm, her expression appropriately somber. If anyone found it strange that the bride showed such composure while her husband wept openly for his dead brother's wife, they kept it to themselves. On Wednesday morning, Martha Henshaw, having survived her own bout of illness through sheer stubborn will, came to Dr. Brennan with a theory. "It was the wine," she said, sitting in his office with her needlework untouched in her lap. "I saw Eleanor near the wine decanters before the feast. She was alone in the dining room for perhaps 10 minutes. Doing what? I don't know. When I asked, she said she was admiring the table settings, but there was something in her hands. A small vial or bottle. She tucked it into her sleeve when she saw me." Dr. Brennan felt his heart rate quicken. "Why didn't you mention this before?" Martha's face crumpled. "I thought I was being foolish. A bride, a girl from a good family. Why would she... But now, with all these deaths, with her standing there at the funerals like a crow at a battlefield. Did you drink wine at the feast, Martha?" 2 glasses. Maybe 3. "And you're alive?" "Barely." Martha touched her throat. "I still feel the burning sometimes, but I'm stronger than most. Always have been." Dr. Brennan made a decision. That afternoon, while the Whitmore family was occupied with another funeral, he went to the house and asked to see the wine cellar. The butler, too weak to argue, gave him the keys. In the cellar, Dr. Brennan found the remaining bottles from the wedding feast. He took samples from 3 different decanters, carefully sealing them in glass vials. He also collected samples of the leftover food that had been preserved in the cold storage. Though most had been destroyed, some remained. He sent these samples by urgent courier to a colleague in Boston, a chemist who specialized in toxicology. The response came back on Friday: arsenic. Large quantities of it, particularly concentrated in the red wine. The news hit Ashford Hollow like a thunderclap. Murder. Not divine judgment, not spoiled food, but deliberate, cold-blooded murder. By Friday afternoon, the village had transformed from a community in mourning to a community in panic and rage. Who had done this? Why? And were they still in danger? Sheriff Edmund Burke, a gruff man of 50 who'd served as the village's law enforcement for 2 decades, convened an emergency meeting with Dr. Brennan, Reverend Whitmore, now recovering though weakened, and several prominent citizens, including Charles Whitmore and the mayor. "The evidence is clear," Dr. Brennan said, placing the chemist's report on the table. The wine was poisoned with white arsenic, likely mixed in sometime before or during the feast. The concentration was high. Anyone who drank multiple glasses received a potentially lethal dose. Charles Whitmore, still grieving his wife, slammed his fist on the table. Someone at that wedding murdered my Prudence, murdered innocent people. Who? Who would do such a thing? Sheriff Burke cleared his throat. We need to consider who had access to the wine. Who could have poisoned it without being noticed? Martha Henshaw's testimony was heard. Her description of seeing Eleanor with a vial near the wine decanters sent a chill through the room. It can't be Eleanor, Jonathan Whitmore said weakly. He'd been called to the meeting and sat pale and trembling in a corner. She's my wife. She had no reason. What do we know about her? Sheriff Burke interrupted. Really know? She appeared here a week before the wedding. We know nothing of her past, her family, her history. Reverend Whitmore shifted uncomfortably. I corresponded with her uncle, a Minister Carver from Hampshire County. He vouched for her character completely. I'd like to speak with this uncle, Burke said. He's deceased. Eleanor's voice came from the doorway. Everyone turned. She stood there in her perpetual black, her face calm, her hands folded. No one had heard her approach. My uncle died 3 months ago, she continued, entering the room uninvited. Consumption. I nursed him in his final days. After his death, I had nowhere to go. When Reverend Whitmore's letters came, proposing the match with Jonathan, I accepted. I had nothing left to lose. Except your reputation, Sheriff Burke said coldly, which will be thoroughly ruined if you don't cooperate with this investigation. I have nothing to hide. Eleanor sat down gracefully. Ask me anything. The interrogation lasted 3 hours. Eleanor answered every question with maddening composure. Yes, she'd been near the wine decanters. She'd been arranging flowers in the dining room. No, she hadn't brought any vials or bottles with her. No, she had no reason to wish harm to anyone in Ashford Hollow. When asked about her family history, Eleanor's answers grew sparse, but remained steady. Her mother had died when she was young. Her father, a merchant, had died 5 years ago, leaving debts. She'd lived with various relatives, attended seminary school, worked briefly as a governess. The uncle who'd arranged her marriage had been her last living relation. Convenient, Charles Whitmore muttered, that everyone who might confirm your story is dead. Eleanor met his eyes without flinching. Grief is not a crime, Mr. Whitmore, nor is survival. Sheriff Burke searched Eleanor's room that evening with Jonathan's reluctant permission. He found no vials, no poison, no incriminating evidence. Her trunk contained only clothes, all black or dark grey, and a few personal items, a Bible, a locked diary, and a small portrait of a woman who might have been her mother. But Burke did find one curious thing, a collection of newspaper clippings, carefully preserved in an envelope. They were old, yellowed, some dated 15 years prior. They all concerned a scandal in Hampshire County involving a merchant named Carver who'd been ruined by false accusations of fraud orchestrated by business rivals. The merchant had died shortly after, reportedly by his own hand. The rivals had never been prosecuted. One name appeared repeatedly in the articles as the primary accuser, Whitmore, specifically Reverend Thomas Whitmore, who at the time had been a younger man running a timber business before taking up ministry. Sheriff Burke brought the clippings to Reverend Whitmore that night. The old man's face crumbled when he saw them. "Dear God," he whispered. "Carver, Edward Carver. I'd forgotten, or tried to forget." "Tell me," Burke demanded. The story came out in fragments, painful and halting. 15 years ago, Reverend Whitmore, then just Thomas Whitmore, businessman, had been in a trade dispute with Edward Carver. Carver had undercut him on a major timber contract, threatening Whitmore's financial stability. In retaliation, Thomas had spread rumors of fraud, of Carver using inferior materials and falsifying documents. The rumors had gained traction. An investigation was launched. Though no fraud was ever proven, Carver's reputation was destroyed. His business collapsed. He lost everything, his livelihood, his home, his standing in the community. The shame and stress triggered a stroke that left him partially paralyzed. His wife died shortly after, some said, of a broken heart. Carver himself died a few years later, destitute and disgraced. "I convinced myself it was just business," Thomas said, his voice breaking, "that I'd done nothing technically wrong. The investigation found no fraud because I'd fabricated the evidence poorly, but the damage was done. I put it out of my mind. When I felt God's call to ministry, I thought it was a new beginning, a chance to atone." "Edward Carver had a daughter," Sheriff Burke said quietly. Thomas Whitmore looked up, and in his eyes was the terrible understanding of a man seeing the consequences of long-buried sins. "Eleanor," he breathed. "She's Carver's daughter." The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. Eleanor Carver, daughter of Edward Carver, the man Thomas Whitmore had destroyed. She'd come to Ashford Hollow not as a bride, but as an avenging angel. The marriage was simply her way into the heart of the family. The feast was her opportunity. "She killed them," Charles said, his face white with fury. "She killed my Prudence, killed innocent people to punish our father for what he did to hers." "We need proof," Burke said, though his voice was grim. "Everything we have is circumstantial. The newspaper clippings prove motive, yes, but not action. We have Martha's testimony about the vial, but Eleanor denied it. We need more." On that night, Sheriff Burke set a watch on Eleanor. She was not to leave the Whitmore house. Jonathan, devastated by the revelations, could barely look at his wife. Eleanor, for her part, maintained her eerie calm. But on Saturday morning, she was gone. Her room was empty, the bed made, her few possessions neatly packed and missing. The only thing left was the locked diary, sitting conspicuously on the pillow. Sheriff Burke opened the diary with steady hands, though his heart hammered against his ribs. The gathered crowd in the Whitmore parlor, Jonathan, Charles, Reverend Thomas, Dr. Brennan, and several others, waited in tense silence. The diary was written in Eleanor's precise, elegant hand. It spanned 5 years, beginning shortly after her father's death. Burke read aloud. "June 14th, 1882. Father is buried today. The grave is unmarked. We cannot afford a stone. Only my uncle and I attended. The men who destroyed him sent no condolences. The Whitmore family, who took everything from us, did not even acknowledge his passing. I stood in the rain and made a promise to my father's memory. They will know what they have done. They will feel what we have felt." The entries continued, documenting Eleanor's transformation from grieving daughter to calculating avenger. She'd spent years researching the Whitmore family, learning their habits, their connections, their vulnerabilities. When her uncle, the minister, fell ill, she'd nursed him, but she'd also used his position to make contact with Reverend Whitmore, planting seeds for the marriage proposal. March 3rd, 1886. Uncle grows worse. Before he dies, I must secure the connection to the Whitmores. I've written to Reverend Whitmore, expressing Uncle's concern for my future. I've mentioned my education, my accomplishments, my gentle nature. I've painted myself as the perfect candidate for his shy younger son. The trap is being set. The courtship had been entirely manufactured. Eleanor had studied Jonathan through letters, learning exactly what to say to win his affection. She'd never loved him. She'd barely thought of him as human, merely as a means to an end. July 20th, 1887, Jonathan writes of his love for me. Poor fool. He sees a demure bride when he should see his father's reckoning. But that's the beauty of it. None of them see. They're so convinced of their own righteousness, their own importance, that they cannot imagine someone like me planning their destruction. The most chilling entries detailed her acquisition and preparation of the poison. August 1st, 1887. Arsenic is remarkably easy to obtain if one knows where to look. It's sold as rat poison, as pigment for wallpaper, as medicine for various ailments. I've collected small amounts over months from different apothecaries in different towns, always under different names. No one suspects a quiet woman in mourning dress purchasing household goods. She'd calculated dosages, studied symptoms, planned every detail. The wine had been her delivery method of choice. Red wine to mask any discoloration, served at a celebration where people would drink freely and joyfully. September 15th, 1887. The wedding is set. I've sewn small pockets into my wedding dress. The vials will be hidden there, easily accessible. During the chaos of the feast, while everyone is distracted by food and celebration, I'll slip the arsenic into the wine decanters. No one watches the servants' corners. No one pays attention to the quiet bride. But the diary revealed something even darker. Eleanor had known exactly who would suffer. She'd studied the family dynamics, the drinking habits. She'd known that Reverend Thomas drank moderately, that Charles and William would drink heartily, that their wives and the other guests would toast repeatedly to the newlyweds. She'd wanted Reverend Thomas to survive. She'd wanted him to watch his family and community suffer and die, knowing it was because of his past sins. His survival was part of the punishment. September 20th, 1887. 3 more days. I think of Father often, how he suffered in silence, too proud to beg, too broken to fight. They took his dignity, his life, his legacy. Now I will take theirs, but unlike them, I will let them know why. Eventually, when enough have died, when the pain is deep enough, I will make sure Thomas Whitmore understands. This is justice for Edward Carver. The final entry was dated the morning of the wedding, September 23rd, 1887. Today I become Eleanor Whitmore. Today I destroy them from within. Father, if you can see this from beyond, know that your daughter did not forget. Know that your suffering was not meaningless. They will remember the name Carver. They will remember what it means to lose everything. When Sheriff Burke finished reading, the silence in the room was absolute. Jonathan Whitmore had his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Reverend Thomas sat like a statue, aged a decade in a single hour. Charles looked murderous. She confessed to everything, Dr. Brennan said finally. This diary is a complete confession. But where is she? Burke demanded. She's been gone for hours. She could be anywhere. A search was organized immediately. Men rode out to neighboring towns, checking train stations, coach stops, any route Eleanor might have taken to escape. But it was as though she'd vanished into the autumn air. It wasn't until late Saturday afternoon that they found her. A farmer reported seeing a woman in black clothes standing by Miller's Creek, a fast-moving stream that fed into the Connecticut River. By the time Sheriff Burke and his men arrived, Eleanor was gone, but they found her dress carefully folded on the bank, with a rock weighing it down. Her shoes were placed neatly beside it. The creek was running high with autumn rains, cold and treacherous. Burke and his men searched the banks for hours, but found no body. The current was strong enough to carry someone miles downstream, possibly all the way to the river. On the folded dress, they found one final note written in Eleanor's precise hand. I have taken what was owed. The debt is paid. Let Thomas Whitmore live with what he has sown. As for me, I go to my father. Perhaps he will be proud of what his daughter became, or perhaps he will be horrified. Either way, I am finished. The search continued for 3 days, but Eleanor Carver Whitmore was never found. The official conclusion was death by drowning, likely suicide. Her body, if it existed, had been swept away by the current, but some in Ashford Hollow wondered. The dress had been too carefully arranged, the note too theatrical. Some believed Eleanor had staged her death and escaped to start a new life elsewhere, her revenge complete. Others insisted she truly had died, unable to live with the weight of what she'd done. Either way, she was gone. The final death toll from Eleanor's poisoning was 13 people. Prudence Whitmore, Adelaide Frost, Robert Hayes, and 10 others, neighbors, friends, family members who'd committed no sin except attending a wedding and drinking wine. The village of Ashford Hollow never recovered. Within 2 years, half the population had moved away, Unable to bear the memories, the Whitmore estate was sold, the family scattered. Charles moved to Boston with his young children, unable to remain in the house where his wife had died. William relocated to New York, cutting all ties with Massachusetts. Jonathan Whitmore suffered perhaps the worst fate. The gentle young man who'd believed himself in love became a ghost of himself. He moved to a small apartment in Providence and worked as a clerk under an assumed name, telling no one about his brief, catastrophic marriage. He never married again. He died in 1903 at age 42 from complications of alcoholism. His death certificate listed him as a widower. Reverend Thomas Whitmore resigned from his ministry. The revelations about his past, his role in destroying Edward Carver, had made him toxic to his congregation. Some believed he deserved what had happened, that Eleanor's revenge was divine justice manifest. Others felt the punishment had exceeded the crime. Thomas lived out his remaining years in a small cottage on the outskirts of a different town, tending a garden and writing long letters of apology that he never sent. He died in 1892 at 65, reportedly calling out Eleanor's name in his final delirium. The church where the wedding had taken place stood empty for a decade before being torn down. The land was eventually sold and a modern building erected, but the locals avoided it. They said the ground was cursed. Dr. Samuel Brennan wrote extensively about the case in medical journals, warning about the dangers of arsenic poisoning and the difficulties in detecting it. His work contributed to better toxicology practices and helped solve similar cases in the future. But he never spoke publicly about Eleanor Carver, feeling that her story was too dark, too disturbing to share beyond medical necessity. Martha Henshaw, who survived the poisoning through sheer constitution, lived to be 83. In her old age, she would sometimes speak of that terrible September, of the bride in black who'd brought death to their celebration. But even Martha, who'd never been shy about gossip, would lower her voice when mentioning Eleanor's name, as though afraid speaking it too loudly might summon something back from the grave. The diary became evidence in a case that would never go to trial. It was eventually sealed by court order and deposited in the county archives, where it remained untouched for decades. Researchers occasionally requested access, but were usually denied. The few who did read it reported feeling unsettled by Eleanor's cold precision, her absolute lack of remorse. As for Eleanor herself, if she survived, she left no trace. No one matching her description was ever reported in neighboring states. No Eleanor Carver or Eleanor Whitmore appeared in census records after 1887. She'd either drowned in Miller's Creek, as the official report stated, or she'd successfully disappeared, perhaps changing her name and starting over somewhere no one knew about the bride who'd poisoned a village. In the years that followed, legends grew around the story. Some said Eleanor's ghost haunted Miller's Creek, walking the banks in her black wedding dress. Others claimed that on foggy autumn nights you could hear wedding bells ringing from the ruins of the old church, followed by the sounds of retching and dying. But these were just stories, the way traumatized communities try to make sense of senseless horror. The truth was simpler and more terrible. Eleanor Carver had been a real person, driven by real grief and real rage to commit real murder. She'd watched her father destroyed by a man's callous business dealings and had decided that suffering demanded suffering in return. Whether her revenge brought her any peace, whether it was worth the 13 lives she took, worth destroying Jonathan's innocence, worth the dissolution of an entire community, only Eleanor could have answered. And she took that answer with her, either to the bottom of a creek or to whatever new life she might have built in the shadows. The village of Ashford Hollow exists now only in property records and archived newspapers. The land was eventually absorbed into neighboring towns. The graves of Eleanor's victims are scattered across New England, most unmarked or forgotten. But in the historical societies of Massachusetts, in the archives of toxicology journals, in the cautionary tales told by those who study the darker corners of American history, the story persists. The bride who wore black to her own wedding. The bride who turned a celebration into a massacre. The bride whose silence was more terrifying than any scream. Eleanor Carver Whitmore, who proved that revenge, when carefully cultivated and patiently executed, could be more deadly than any poison. And perhaps most unsettling of all, the knowledge that somewhere in the dusty records of the late 19th century there might be other Eleanor Carvers, other quiet women in mourning dress, carrying their grief and their rage, waiting for the perfect moment to make the world feel what they had felt. The story ended, but the question remained. Had justice been served? Or had Eleanor Carver simply created more suffering, more tragedy, more grief to echo through the generations? The village of Ashford Hollow couldn't answer. The graves couldn't answer. History couldn't answer. In the end, perhaps that was Eleanor's final cruelty, leaving behind not closure, but an eternal, uncomfortable question about the nature of justice, revenge, and the terrible things that grief can make of us. The wedding dress, found folded by the creek, was eventually burned, but some say that on certain autumn nights in New England, when the fog rolls thick through the valleys and the maple leaves fall like blood, you can still smell smoke, and beneath it, faintly the bitter scent of almonds that characterizes arsenic. The bride came, the bride poisoned, the bride vanished, and the village died with her secrets. If this story sent chills down your spine, hit that like button and let me know in the comments what you think really happened to Eleanor. Did she die in that creek? Or is she still out there somewhere? Don't forget to subscribe for more dark tales from history. Until next time, stay safe, and maybe think twice before accepting a wedding invitation.